The first affirmative rebuttal. I would say a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this video is really dependent on the context in which this speech occurs. You need to remember that this speech occurs right after the negative block. So the negative team has had 13 minutes of basically uninterrupted speaking time to really establish their arguments. And this speech is only 5 minutes long. So there is a vast asymmetry or inequality in the amount of time the negative just had and in the amount of time the 1AR has. So that's going to determine a lot of how we approach this speech. That makes it the most time-pressured speech in the entire debate. Because you only have 5 minutes to respond to 13 minutes of arguments. So that makes the 1AR very tricky. And so the goal is not going to be to really go really in depth like the 2AR will have the opportunity to, or like the negative block was able to. Instead, the 1AR is sort of this time-pressured speech that's just trying to get through enough stuff to keep their partner and their AF side alive. So your job is going to be to extend the most important 2AC arguments. You want to make sure you don't undercover any major arguments that the negative brought up. So for instance, if they have a big disadvantage, you want to make sure that you get to that and that you respond to it adequately and that you don't undercover some other issues. And then at the same time, you want to preserve the big picture affirmative story. Now, here's what makes the 1AR kind of tricky. You're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, you might be tempted to try to respond to all the line-by-line arguments that the negative block made, in which case you will probably lose sight of the big picture story of the affirmative. I see this all the time. 1AR stand up, they're like, oh my God, the negative team throughout the entirety of the negative block made 18 arguments. I need to respond to all of them. And if they go and try to really do that, then they're going to be spread too thin. And then conversely, they could try to focus more on just preserving the big picture story of why the affirmative is a good idea, right? The overall narrative that they want the judge to remember, and then they will inevitably drop important negative arguments. So there's a fine balancing act the 1AR needs to do where they don't go too far into the line by line, and then the judge just loses sight of the affirmative story, and then it becomes a lot easier to buy the negative side of things. And conversely, you want to make sure you don't focus so much on the big picture that you lose sight or that you drop important arguments. And so I guess what I'm getting at is the 1AR needs to value efficiency above everything else. I mean, that's the goal. The art of the 1AR, successful 1ARs, is just getting through everything with enough time. So let's talk about the structure. Again, it's similar to everything else we've seen before, but I'll note a couple of differences. You begin with an overview, and since this is one of the final rebuttals, it should be that retroactive phrasing, where you're phrasing things in the past tense, where you make it clear how the negative team has failed to respond to the most important affirmative claims. Again, review the 2NR video if you want some review of this past tense retroactive phrasing that I'm talking about. But I think perceptually it's very important to have the attitude that you presented these arguments in the 2AC and the negative team failed to adequately respond to them in the negative block. That attitude will really help perceptually. You want to keep the overview short and succinct. You want to avoid overviews that stretch on for too long. Again, this is really the place where I see a lot of 1ARs mess up. They end up giving a 50-second overview and it was just far too long. You need to keep the 1AR overview tight, no longer than 30 seconds, ideally 20 seconds, just a couple of sentences that really establish that core story. Then you'll transition to the stock issues. And again, remember to define the stock issues and frame the burdens. Push back especially on whatever negative burden framing they had. Like the negative team will always try to be pushing that if the affirmative team loses anything, that they should therefore lose the debate. Or that if they prove that you don't solve 100% of the harms, then you should lose. And so you need to push back against that and help the judge to understand instead how they should be looking at the round. And then you answer line-by-line arguments under the stock issues. So this is just the same as other speeches, right? Kind of overview, then transition to stock issue with a little summary of what this stock issue is all about, and then getting to the particular issues there. Now, here is my advice. First, do not make entirely new arguments, all right? Use the 2AC arguments to respond to the specific arguments made in the negative block. All right, you don't have time to establish new arguments. You don't want to be reading new evidence. Instead, there's a delicate art to 1AR extensions. You don't want to be making entirely new arguments because you don't have the time. But on the other hand, you also want to make sure that you are not just extending 2AC arguments in a really shallow and superficial way. So there is an art to kind of developing a little bit and recontextualizing it to what's going on here. That's kind of my next bullet point. These two go hand in hand, is contextualize and develop the 2AC arguments to respond to the negative block. I would say the best way to extend 2AC arguments is to do it in a way that responds to the specific claims that were made in the negative block. So it really requires recontextualizing the 2AC claims to how the negative developed their arguments. Let's go into a specific example because I think it'll help a lot. All right. So imagine this situation. We're debating whether or not Marines should be withdrawn from Japan. The 1NC makes the argument that withdrawing U.S. Marines would hurt the United States' ability to deter our adversaries and respond rapidly to disasters. Pretend they read evidence on this. Then the 2AC, your team stands up, your partner reads evidence and responds, explaining that, U.S. Marines in Japan actually make other nations feel more threatened, which ultimately hurts stability. So notice it's a nice offensive argument in response to this. The negative team is saying, no, this is important for deterrence. The affirmative says, actually, this just threatens other nations and harms stability. So now let's say the negative team stood up and, extended this argument and tried to develop this argument by going into two specific examples, China and North Korea. They say that, ultimately, China and North Korea have not gone to war. There has been no serious escalation because they know that the U.S. Marines are there and they're this stabilizing presence in the region. And let's say they even read two pieces of evidence. So you can imagine in the negative block that this could have been a hefty portion. This could have been 4 minutes of them really explaining the disadvantage, extending their 1NC arguments, bringing up new evidence to support China and North Korea, empirical examples. Okay, so what are you going to do in the 1AR? You can imagine it would not be very strategic to just stand up and superficially assert the 2AC argument that the troops haven't helped with stability, right? It simply wouldn't sound responsive to the negative block. Instead, I think the 1AR should make sure to develop their arguments and respond to the specific examples that the negative team brought up, especially for an argument as important as this one, like a disadvantage. If you lose this, this is probably the core part of the negative strategy. So the 1AR in this instance should probably explain how the examples of China and North Korea are flawed. They should bring up the 2AC argument, but develop it a little bit further, showing that the examples of China and North Korea are flawed because the exact opposite of stability has been achieved by having the Marines stationed in Japan. The 1AR could cite the numerous examples of China's staking claims on disputed islands in the South China Sea, on North Korea testing nuclear missiles, and connect those claims back to the 2AC's argument that when the U.S. puts an imposing military presence at the doorstep of countries like China and North Korea, they feel the need to develop their military and lash out in order to protect their sovereign territory. And so ultimately, the 1AR is making the same argument that the 2AC made, but they're explaining it in a way that's responsive to the exact arguments made by the negative block. And hopefully, those claims are supported by the evidence the 2AC read. So you can develop your arguments a little bit more, especially for arguments like this that the negative block really expanded on, and you can help to develop those arguments. You're not going to have this room to develop arguments like this at every instance, but you want to make sure that you're not just superficially extending a 2AC argument that's no longer really responding to the specific development that the negative team had in the block. Let's keep going to some other tips. Make sure to prioritize which 2AC arguments are absolutely essential to extend. Make sure to prioritize which 2AC arguments are absolutely essential to extend. And that's usually the most important offense. Sometimes the 2AC will make 3 responses to an argument, and oftentimes the 1AR won't have time to do that. And so I really recommend discussing with your partner the 2A, because the 1AR is only important insofar as it gives the 2AR enough ammunition, enough of what they need to win the debate without the judge thinking that, it hadn't been extended really throughout the debate. You don't want the 2AR to feel new. If the 2AR feels new, there's just a high chance the judge will dismiss it because that's what they're rightly told to do before the debate. And so you want to talk with your partner and ask your partner what he wants to go for in the 2AR against these arguments. And usually it should be the most important offensive argument or the best argument that you had. That was typically probably the first argument in the 2AC blocks. Okay. So you won't be able to respond to or extend all three of the 2AC arguments typically. Just focus on extending the refutation to the negative arguments. That was most important, especially if you're time pressured. Another good strategy is to what's called group arguments whenever possible. So if you notice, for instance, that there are a lot of negative arguments that are circulating around the same issue. For instance, if the negative has 2 to 4 arguments in the block about implementation issues with the affirmative plan under the stock issue of solvency, then the 1AR could stand up and group those arguments that deal with implementation. You would say, the next 3 negative arguments are all about implementation questions around the plan. However, all of these are fixed by the fact that, and then you would explain your answer to all of them. A second way to think about grouping arguments is to think about how a core affirmative argument can answer multiple negative arguments in one fell swoop. And so the goal should be to kill as many birds with a single stone as often as possible so that you're still answering all the arguments, but you can do so in a very efficient way. Rather than saying, the negative second argument is this, and that is wrong because, the negative's third argument is this, and that is wrong because, and the negative's fourth argument is this, but that is wrong because. If your warrant for why all those arguments are wrong, just group them together and offer one explanation that explains the overarching reason why the negative team is missing the boat here. All right. You want to make sure, though, that you are not giving an oversimplified or superficial response when you're grouping arguments. That's something I see sometimes in the name of efficiency. I sometimes see 1ARs try to group too many arguments together, and then they end up not really responding to them in a robust way. And good negative teams will exploit that. Finally, watch the time. Right? Decide which arguments you really need to respond to and make sure you don't run out of time. Sometimes you won't be able to answer every single argument, and that's okay, right? Obviously, it's not ideal. Obviously, you want to, but it's essential that you ask which arguments are truly the most threatening, which ones you truly need to respond to if push comes to shove and you have to make tough choices, all right? So the negative team extends arguments. Sometimes the negative team will extend arguments just to try to spread you a little bit thin. And so it's always better to focus on the most threatening arguments that generate the best offense for the negative and would set them up for a strong win against you. So that's my advice. Again, end of the day, 1AR is really just about holding the line, about making sure you're not spread too thin, making sure you don't let the negative flank you by undercovering a stock issue, and really just preserving that affirmative story. So hopefully that makes sense. Practice makes perfect, as always. So be sure to practice this and to give rebuttal redos again if you feel that after a debate that you really botched the 1AR, the best way to improve is to give a rebuttal redo, where you try giving that speech again, this time fixing the mistakes that you made the first time. So hopefully that all makes sense. If you have questions, let me know.